Hello everyone, we're going to start the seminar. And by the way, I'm not the speaker, I'm just sharing. So, welcome to all to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. My name is George Kunnath. I'm an associate professor and lifelong engagement lead for the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity program at IAI. I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled, How Do Inheritance Shape Wealth Inequality? Evidence from India, which is part of the IAI Inequality Seminar Series. Today's speakers are Dr. Kalaiyarasan Arumugam and Vikash Vaibhav. Dr. Kalaiyarasan Arumugam is an assistant professor at Madras Institute Development Studies, Chennai, India, and a visiting research fellow at the King's College London. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow at visiting assistant professor at Walton Institute, Brown University, and a research faculty at National Institute of Labor Economics Research and Development. His academic interest lies in understanding patterns of inequalities and comparative political economy in the global south. Second speaker, Dr. Vikash Vaibhav is an assistant professor at Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. He was earlier associated with Dr. B.R. Ambedkar School of Economics, Bangalore. Dr. Vaibhav is interested in key Indian developmental questions, including poverty, inequality, regional disparity, rural industrialization, and education. May I ask our online audience to please keep yourselves muted. As usual, there will be a chance to pose your questions to the speakers following their presentation. We will take questions both from in-person and online audience. Now I will hand over to speakers. Many thanks to all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the event. Over to you, Kalay and Vikash. You have around 40 to 45 minutes.
Yes.
And then we will have Q&A.
Thank you so much, George, for this generous introduction. And thank you, Mr. Peter, for making this event possible, and also Professor Ferraria, Director of IAI, for having us here. And this is in a collaborative work, and it's a presentation as my co-author, my colleague and co-author with Vikash Vaibhav. And as you know, of the inequality debate and is there across, it's picked up in the last decade, and for a long time economists have neglected this question. Now it became back to the table in most of the countries, and India is no exception to that trend. And given this, and I'm making very provocative argument, because it is seen that the last 30 years of economic reform has increased inequality across the world. No country exception to that trend. Only maybe the level and the degree would vary across country, and the kind of indicators that one use perhaps would give us a different result. But India case is no exception to that trend. India has been a rich debate on inequality, on drivers of inequality, on various measures, particularly the consumption or the income as an indicator of inequality has been, discussed and argued about it. And this is rich. It is definitely, there's no uncontested argument. The deficit has definitely gone up, and particularly after Thomas Piketty's magnum opus of his work on across countries. Now, what is our argument? We are making a very specific argument here, in particularly with respect to wealth in India. And we make a claim that the wealth inequality, particularly inherited wealth, over that determines the contemporary inequality in India. What do you mean by that? In this sense, there is a debate, as I mentioned earlier, that the economic reform is a source of ill, in the sense of the source of rise of the wealth inequality in India. We make a claim, it is true, but that wealth inequality in particular is much more rooted, much more historical. It has both colonial and post-colonial connection, and that shapes the wealth inequality than the economic reform initiated in the 1990s. Economic reform indeed magnified it, but the root lies in the colonial and the post-colonial regime, longer period of time. And therefore, the distinction that we make generally, as economists do, between the equality of opportunity vis-a-vis outcome is blurring, because many of these inequalities, of the different component of these inequalities, are embedded in political and social and transferred over of time, intergenerationally transferred over a period of time. So it is more rooted in that political and historical and social regime than the contemporary economic factors that generally one tend to see understanding inequality. Where does India stand? As I mentioned, no doubt, India is one of the highly most unequal countries in the world, any measure that you take. If you take the wealth, it is one of the worst in that sense of the inequality. Of course, income and consumption. In this literature, most of the indicators are, most of the authors used usually the income measures and consumption. Some have used wealth too. For instance, the World Inequality Report used income measures, and Piketty and Chancellor used measuring what they call as a British Raj to billionaire Raj, explaining how the inequality traveled over, the trend been over a period of time, and they call roughly 100 years of period, making use of income tax return data. And there's also journalist account, but it's well recorded by most of the rich interview-based work, which is called as a billionaire's balloon, which the Cadbury calls from moving from oligarch to oligarch, in the sense having more millionaires, more billionaires in India that India ever seen, say, 30 years before. And this is other work using the same data that we are using here, which is AIDIS. I'll come back to that question later, but the authors have used Anand and other set of scholars, making the case that the economic reform is the reason for rise in wealth inequality there. If this is something that we want to contest, of course, it is true, economic reform has contributed, but I think we argue that it's much more rooted in historical context. And as I mentioned, wealth inequality is always, any country for that matter, is always higher than the income and consumption. This is the range you see: first wealth, then followed by income, followed then consumption. But only difference, India's wealth inequality is one of the highest in terms, even in the level of, forget about changing over a period of time. And why this is possible, there's other economics account which says because certain millionaires, billionaires are actually well connected to the power center of the policy space, particularly through certain sector, which the economists Gandhi and Walton calls as a rent-thick sectors, in the sense the sector which has some connection with the government, having licenses and other aspects, tend to flourish in particularly last 30 years. You call as a, if you like to call as a crony capitalism in other sense, which are sole responsible for increase in the wealth inequality. And all of this are true, but what we are going to make here is we're going to look at, let's not looking at the higher end. Some of this actually data, some of this argument cannot be captured by survey-based data sets. No survey. Why? Because the survey data generally does not capture the super rich, particularly those who are associated with the stock market, or the fluctuation is much high. The data doesn't capture. So instead, let's look at the average median wealth, like take any health, and see the both upper end and the bottom. Look at the distribution across time and see what are the different component of the wealth come from. Let's go into the disaggregated, more very granular level of data, how the different component of wealth actually evolved over a period of time. What are those connections of the wealth components, of the different components driving the wealth inequality that we see, which has gone up in India. Now, the data that is available with us, this is again, this is data is done by the government of India itself. It's like we have some 30 years period of data from 1992, 1919 to 2019, and each round will have some more than lakhs observation of households, and we use certain price index to make the series constant. Therefore, we can calculate the growth rate. There are certain items we included, certain items we excluded. For instance, we covered in this data roughly some 8 assets. So because what we get from the earlier accounts are the aggregate wealth with certain, with the forecasting, certain assumption being made, by Oxfam or even other scholars are used in aggregate level. But what we are going to look at here is look at very granular level, each of these assets. What are those assets actually which drives the wealth over a period of time? So we have here as 8 assets, including land, building, livestock, till the financial resources. And we excluded typically loan and gold. Some of them are not comparable over a period of time. And as I mentioned, the caveat, two caveat applies very clearly for any survey data, particularly for wealth. One, it underestimates the super wealthy. It excludes, for instance, whether this data covers Ambanis or Adanis in India, may not be, maybe, we don't know, but definitely it excludes those who are associated with high-end, maybe top 0.001%, does not capture this. And it's very difficult to capture those households. And this is definitely wealth, but definitely better than income and consumption that we have as a measure of inequality. Then the final one, which is another caveat, which been very much argued within economic discipline and literature, that wealth, physical wealth is not a sufficient way of tracking inequality. What about the human capital? Human capital, education in particular, is the modern source of inequality, particularly developing world, and even developing, which is catching up with the modernity. Therefore, the access to education matters, which we do discuss in this data, in this analysis, but does not add up into the wealth measurement. So what we have is the 8 component of the assets. And look at directly figure. As I mentioned, India is no exception, as to the global trend of rising inequality. Look at this trend since 1990. The middle and black one as the aggregate wealth, particularly for rural, and the right side is urban. If you look at the simply in the rural, which is 0.65, it's a Gini coefficient. Look at, it's just gone up to 68, which is as a period of India's high growth. And the latest period is moderated, and there are reasons why it moderated, but it's not really came down, almost quite similar to the position what 1992. So therefore, we say here, and similarly in urban, you can see 70 it was in 92, and definitely it has gone up to 75 in the 2013 Gini coefficient, when I say 75, and moderated again in 2000. So now both actually tells us that there seems to be rise in inequality, but it's moderated. Then why the question of debate about what is the worry that we have? The question that I mentioned earlier, it is not about the rise of wealth inequality last 30 years. It is already the level was high. Why that high? We'll come back to, that's a story that we want to explore. What are the different components of wealth which are so entrenched in India, which keeps its wealth level even in 30 years before at much higher level? And you can clearly see here the 3 components that we have added here, which are very important drivers of the wealth. We'll explain that in a bit, which one are those, the land and the building and the financial asset. And the land and building, look at the land in particular, it has always been more than the aggregate wealth, which I'll come back in a while. I can say now it is 60% of the rural wealth, 69% of the rural wealth comes from the land. In the urban too. And these 2 assets actually was the main drivers of the wealth inequality in India, the land and building, particularly so for the urban. And how this actually worked over a period of time, whether, this is another question that we all have, who gained from this movement of the wealth last 30 years? This actually one can say simply maybe a class angle of wealth. This is not just a level, it is, trend over a period of time. Again, you can clearly see in the, particularly in the urban area, it is in the particularly for first actually 40% as no growth, in fact, lesser than the rest of the, you can say the first 50% of the population have not gained as much as others have gained. In fact, it's a negative for some. So this is actually is the story for the, at each percentile, you can see the, look at it, you can go in detail actually the growth rate, each percentile we calculated, and we clearly see the class polarization within the wealth. And this again, how much this is contribute, can be explained by the reform is another again the question. But definitely this was set in already in the 90s itself, and which only got magnified and which actually get reflected in the growth process as poor seems to have lost than the richer, particularly till the 34 or 37 percentile in the urban. We can see in the rural too, it's not much difference except in the at the higher end of the rural. Now, what are those components? As I mentioned, the main components of the drivers of the wealth is the land and the buildings. If you take together land and buildings, which in India's calculation, this is the only data sets available. 90% of wealth in rural India come from simply land and buildings, and the rest is the financial and transport and equipments, etc. And the second forms of wealth for the urban, it is almost 85% come from the land and buildings. So one may ask this question, because we also have asset data, from NFHS and other ISDS, they also use as a wealth data. But remember that wealth they calculate is including, say, TVS 50 or the two-wheelers, perhaps, even the, washing machine, that kind of assets is the household level of, asset, which called durables, we did not include in this. We took as what you call as the big ones, which actually takes economics call as a stock one, which takes a longer period of time to change. Because, for example, land and buildings takes a longer time, say, compared to TV or a washing machine at home. So even that way, because they did not include those rest of those analysis did not include this kind of the asset which takes a longer time, which kind of stock we call as a land and buildings. So in this case, it's 85% in the urban. And if you take the rural and urban for land alone, and you can see that, as I mentioned, 70% of the wealth in India come from land alone in rural. And the 49% in 2019 come from for urban land alone, and which actually has gone up, which is from 40 to 49. This is actually a story, one of the main story that we say connected to the economic reform, because the economic reform, one has to ask the question, what is the mechanism through which wealth actually gone up? Is it the apparent professionals gained income through the labor market, then they made a saving, through that they acquired a wealth, therefore the wealth has gone up? Or is just inherited wealth which actually invested in a particular way of real estate and others, or the land value or the building value simply magnified because of the real estate or a construction turn in India, which are actually is a questionable, but a lot of the ethnographic anthropological studies tell us that, say, different cities in India, take those who are familiar with, or Pune or Bombay or Tamil Nadu or Hyderabad, you'll find in different cities how the urban growth has taken place in recent time and the role of land and real estate driving those urban growth. I think this rise of the land value alone in asset or the wealth formation is very important and connected to that real estate and construction turn of the 90s. Now we have the other issues with this, understanding of how this, we have argued, we're clear now of the land and buildings. But another question that we have is the post-90s also a time which actually opened up the modern economy. India is a service-driven economy. 65% of the GDP comes from the service, and the service connection is more connected to the education. Then we looked at how the education and connected to the different assets in India, which is in fact, this actually for us is very surprising result for us. This is simple correlation. We are not making any position here from causality from whether A2 needs to be, simply the correlation between the different assets. Here you see definitely education, here education in the sense is the household head of the education, whether being educated also makes sense that the household is happen to be the more wealthier. Definitely there is a positive correlation. Being educated and being wealthier is more correlated. But if you take the land, that's very interesting. It need not be correlated. In the sense, being someone landed does not mean having better educated, or being better educated does not mean having a more land share. So that's something is which is normally is again the sociological logic, right? Those who are familiar with Bourdieu, different forms of capital, how the conversion factor takes place from one capital to other capital. India's that conversion factor seems to be not neat. Perhaps this would vary for the different caste groups, or the, also would vary the different regions. But the macro level data is this, that it's not directly connected. Education does not mean, being educated does not mean one wealthier. So that is why we intend to argue. I think the 90s of the turn or the rise in the wealth needs to be seen how much it's connected to the economic reform. Even if it is, what are the way in which that influence the wealth? That has to be studied. Given this relationship, let's look at this relationship with respect to, definitely again, if you look at the education and the finance, definitely there is a positive correlation. If you are being educated, has a better chance of having more financial wealth, in the sense, share, in bank balance, etc. But not with the land, not with the buildings. So I think there seems to be some break here, and we try to look at what drives, and just simply then controlling the education, controlling the financial share in the household. We looked at over a period of time how the coefficient varies, what actually, how much is significant. Definitely the land is the single most driver of wealth, even now, in terms of its share, in terms of its significance level, because it's a continuous variable. And it definitely, its influence has come down post 2003, but because it's not because it's in overall driver has come, overall effect has come down. It's because if you add education and financial share, there seems to be pitting down of the land effect in driving the total wealth. But this even now is the main driver of economic, the wealth, economic wealth, physical wealth in rupees in India. So this is, and like you can say, with the super confidence, with the statistical data, and also we can substantiate that with the field work done by the different geographers and the different regions in India. Now, so how this actually connected to the caste question? Because as I mentioned earlier, in every percentile, you see the differences. Here, if you look at again the caste terms, in same thing, you will find, it is one interesting difference. The caste hierarchy is very much gets reflected here in wealth hierarchy. If you know, those who are not familiar with caste hierarchy in India, India has this what I call as a 4 stage, or maybe the 5 set of hierarchy. If you like to call Ambedkar words, it's kind of ladder, and nobody can climb up in the ladder. That kind of hierarchically placed, and it has each respect of occupations, and that actually gets reflected in the wealth position too of the different communities. This is all administrative categories. Don't take this as a caste alone. There are different communities, but broadly this grouping of the 4 grouping tells us this is what available with us from the data sets. It tells us the hierarchically placed. You can see on the yellow line on the right, which is the called as the upper caste, UC, then followed by the OBC, which are middle caste, then followed by the scheduled caste, then the ST. Only different here is the ST seems to be doing better in some cases, in some regions in India, because the scheduled tribe is more connection to the land ownership. I think that's the only thing. If you look at the land value, I can show you the next graph. Clearly, the scheduled tribe seems to be having a better ownership than the scheduled caste, actually, which are simply the farm laborers and of the historically of the laboring class in the country, than the OBC largely of the middle. And remember, there's no, except in some pockets in across percentile, from the 0 to 1, in every level they see the differences actually of the assets. And if you see, take the land alone, and clearly you see, as I mentioned, the scheduled tribe seems to overcome the scheduled caste, particularly for the historical location. So this is precisely our argument is how much this wealth that we see in the post-90s can be explained. Of course, it magnified because of the land value price and the other investment, but this inequality was already built in the system. And that goes for perhaps to the colonial regime, which I come back in detail. So therefore, the land and the caste, if you see, very important connection here. Again, you see the land ownership, you clearly hierarchically placed. And if you take the value of land distribute across caste groups, you clearly see, scheduled caste as a lower end, overtaking the scheduled tribe, overtaking scheduled caste. And you should, as expected, the OBC in between, and the UC at the top. And this again, if you take whatever measure, we try to do multiple measures. In every measure you see, and the gradation of the caste persists. And this is to land. Earlier graph we had shown of the total wealth. Remember, in the land, the drivers in each of these caste groups, land alone contributes roughly 60% of the wealth. Land alone. And if you add up buildings, roughly around another 20-25% if you take the urban alone. So there's a variation, particularly for the financial wealth across caste groups, which we couldn't show here, but that's a trend over a period of time. Now, so this is the broad trend. We know now the land, buildings, and recent time of the finance. This actually three constitute roughly 90+% of the wealth. Transport, urban equipment, all of those are very minor. Of course, if you take the factories, this is only the household level wealth, which does not capture many of those super rich financial wealth. Household level, this is the trend. Now the question is, when you have a situation of the 80 to 90% of the wealth come from land and buildings alone, how much this is actually can be attributed to the last 30 years? Is that anything built before? So that clearly, if you look at the data, it clears with even a Gini coefficient, even 92 was almost much higher than most of the countries. So now, how do we explain this inherited gap? This clearly inherited before 90s. So how do we explain this? This is then we'll have to look at the historian, other economists who have worked on the history of political economy of the country, and clearly they show it is definitely gap. We are clear that it is the generation after generation fall, particularly the land. Of course, the building was, one can claim that it was added in the post-90s, but the land definitely inherited over a period of time. So therefore, this wealth cannot be explained simply savings and earnings, which we generally connect with the human capital, then connect with the labor market. Having the access to the labor market or access to education, acquiring skills, and through entering the labor market generates wealth is perhaps the financial wealth. But the hard fact like a land and building, I think partly large part of our inherited. So the education alone is a great leveler or the contributor of wealth is, I think, given this trend seems to be overestimation of the education role in that sense. Therefore, historical legacy actually matters. So what is historical legacy in the Indian context? Then again, this takes us to asking, looking at the historians, what historians has to say, or the, other analysis, taking the historical data sets, we can see again in India's history, the way in which the colonial regime worked, giving ownership to the land actually differed across region, worked in the Madras presidency or the Rayatwari or the Zamindari system or the Maghalwari in this what you call the northwestern worked differently, but one thing predominant or common across this land tenurial system is an arbitrarily assigned ownership to certain communities. Because this, particularly if I am using here the recent book of the Niladri Bhattacharya's work in Punjab, and it arbitrarily, when I arbitrarily say who are the cultivators, who are the not cultivators, that land definition was actually defined by colonial regime, and that also got encoded and inscribed in the land governance categories itself. That continued in the post-colonial. So then question one would ask, in the post-independence, there was a land distribution, there was a land reform. Do you think how much that land reform actually affected the land ownership? Again, we just collected some data on the historical account too, and also the different analysis done by others in the different regions. Clearly, the four legislations that were key in shifting the land ownership in India, one are the tenants to ownership, tenants to land to tenants, and the second is the abolition of the Zamindari. Third is the ceiling on land holdings. Fourth is the consolidation of land holdings. Among the four, first two worked in the sense those who are tenants or the abolition of Zamindari worked facilitating certain intermediate communities, and leaving this other two. This did not work at all, because this actually is the reason for the higher level of ownership of the, inequality in land. Remember, in our earlier figure, almost 72% in terms of Gini coefficient for the land holding. So one of the highly unequal terms. It's like one can think of not exactly latifundia of the Latin American case, but definitely it is in certain pockets was consolidation of land. Again, if you follow the logic of Rudolph and Rudolph, what they call as intermediate dominant communities, who became the landlords in each of the regions in India. And that pattern continued. In fact, that section is the one which actually gained through the land reform, gained in the Green Revolution of the 70s or the pre-90s, but also gained in the post reform, which actually what some anthropologists call as a real estate or a speculative turn of the economy of India, which is called land value speculation. This you can, this is well documented by by definitely of the sociologist Guru Rani in the case of Gurgaon, and some cases in Bombay, of Pune by Chai Balakrishnan, how the different communities, particularly of this landholding communities, negotiated with the state, getting the higher price, negotiated with the private capital, getting higher prices, and definitely there was a land commodification and connection with the buildings. That actually is the contribution of are the main drivers of inequality. In fact, it is not a quantity of effect, it is more of the price effect that actually drove this inequality in the post-90s. And one interesting case here, the land value also, which clearly here in our data also shows, definitely there is a price raise of the value of the land, even similar quantity. And that is actually, that question is what defines a land price? Historically, if you think the fertile land or the land one owns, it's defined by largely fertility. If you know the classical political economy Ricardian differential rent, the value of the rent is different based on the productivity of the land. The productivity again is the amount of labor put in or the kind of making it fertile. But in the post-90s, the land value is not defined by the fertility or the productivity debate. It is based on the how much it's connected to the expressive, how much is connected to the urban developments or location, its position. That rights, and as I mentioned, historically certain communities had a land, and therefore caste actually underwrites of the land valuation, even the way in which, because in the region, particularly in the regional political economy, caste and regional political economy are also very connected. Certain communities have a more influence in the power, shaping the state policies, even real estate, SEZ, special economic zones, etc. That really connects the land pattern. So now, even this is one level of the economic processes. Even if you look at the institutions of the state institutions, how that facilitate, again, your state policies, the kinship or the cultural norms also facilitated transfer. Selling land market becoming selling across, outside of the community became very, very, of course, in the particular areas, in the urban development areas, definitely took place. But broadly, the land actually was, continuing between for over a period of time. That was a pre-90s period. Post-colonial India, as Indian divided family is also as an institution. It worked. Other communities also worked. Other religious community also their own added their own what you call personal laws, which allowed property regimes particular way to move. And these are all actually certain way actually controlled, preserved. Many of this also did not allow, many of these institutions also did not allow women to have ownership, which became a big battle in India in different states. It's a long story. Prem Chaudhary has recorded very much in the case of Haryana Jats in particular, which actually is one of the landed community in Haryana. So this is a range of messy institutions in India which actually preserved the land and preserved, protected also from the state in a way of controlling this land, which continued over a period of time, particularly the post-90s in the process that I mentioned, described here. Now, given this, what is the policy interventions? Is the tax structure or our fiscal policy? How much they are able to take the advantage of this or generate revenue from this wealth inequality, or which we call as a taxation processes or expansion of the state capacity for the public provision of goods, which is again is India is one of the poor ratio of state capacity or the fiscal space in the world. So partly that is to do with the taxation structure, and direct tax available for India is one is income tax, another is corporate tax. So the no land related taxation were allowed except through via the capital gain. There was no process that way of even in the appreciation of the land price is being, were taxing those base. No, it was not. In fact, the wealth and inheritance was abolished in the recent time because the policymakers felt that, having this tax law is more cumbersome, more administrative cost than the rent, the money that come with this taxes. They abolished both wealth and inheritance taxes in the recent times. And even the agricultural income is not counted. Of course, anyway, now the agricultural income is already is limiting in that way. Share is coming down in the GDP. Even historically, the agricultural income was never taxed, right? Those who are familiar with the political economy of India, in late 70s, there was a Kane Roche committee for taxing agricultural income, which was actually because of the lobby, the landed lobby pushed that, and there was no agriculture tax. The post-90s, agriculture could not become in a way of generating enough surplus in that sense, but definitely even via land appreciation, even that was not even taxed. So the capital gain tax covers part of it, but not fully enough in that sense of taking the entire shift that was in a way. It's a rentier income in a way, if just simply the appreciation of the land value. So in this context, then we are clear now, the differences that we have in the wealth is not simply because of one's effort or education or jobs or income. It is more of passed from generation to the one generation to the second generation, the next. And simply the improvement in access education, again, the access education now historically India is underprovided education. Now it expanded its primary schools, but higher education continue to be having inequality many ways. But even if you level it off, whether that will actually resolve your wealth inequality is a question, given the inherited nature and the hard fact, hard level of its movement. And in this context, what the economists use, Paul Romer uses of the equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. I think that distinction may not be working in India's case, because even if you ensure equality of opportunity, assuming through some access, through some affirmative action, or of the state policies making schools better, but how much that will resolve this level of wealth inequality is a very serious question. In that sense, the idea of equality of opportunity is a solution to the liberal claim of the solution. Perhaps again, given even to have that equality of opportunity is difficult in the contemporary times, in the what you call the rise of populism globally. But addressing wealth inequality definitely is, I think, is much tougher than given this enormity of this resources. But then if you simply think of subsidies, scholarship, access to subsidies, what subsidies India has, it is like this energy is very important, no doubt, or even midday meals or the PDS. These are all very important schemes, but will this address this level of inequality in wealth is a question that I think we're not sure of, but looks like it's not, given its enormity. I don't think it's insufficient. That's what we tend to conclude from here. And given this, now, how does this well-entrenched inequality is connected to the policy space? Is a question again. There's another literature we can think of this connecting, which is from what you call Pranavaran thesis, because he says the three dominant classes since 1950 and independence controlled the policy space in India. According to him, those three dominant or propertied classes are big capital, landed elites, and educational professional. And he also revised his thesis to make a claim the landed elite seems to have lost to the big capital in the post-90s. But I would argue, from given this level of wealth inequality driven by the land, landed too gained through the wealth, and therefore all three classes, that sense, definitely benefited from this well-entrenched ideological system of legitimizing social inequality in this country. And one definite continuity, we would say, from the pre-90s and the post-90s is the wealth, and particularly through this mechanism that I just mentioned of the land and the property. This is actually continued to be the same. Of course, the post-90s magnified, but many actually think the problem began at the 90s. What we generally know of the neoliberal economic reform is the source of all ills in the country. Yes, definitely there are issues with that in terms of withdrawal of the state, subsidies, the way we think of economics, all that. But with respect to wealth, I think we tend to argue it's much more rooted, much more historical, much more entrenched even before 90s. In fact, that still controls or the shapes the policy regime. In fact, if there's a conflict between the landed and the big capital, that's what we have been seeing through the land reform bill, the farm bills and other things. I think there's something political economy of this wealth and policy space is going on. And definitely that still controls, shapes even the redistributive politics in the post-90s, even our contemporary times. And the conclusion broadly one can make here is our land or the inherited property still continues to play an important role in average Indian household wealth. Assumption I have to make again the caveat, we are not able to cover in this data set super rich who directly connected with the of the stock market, whose valuation goes up in every minute, every days. That definitely is not being covered. So here largely is a hereditary wealth, and that actually is the predominant or the major source of the wealth, particularly for rural and also urban in the recent time. And economic reform, I mean, contributed, but actually the story goes before economic reform. Perhaps it magnified via real estate and other forms of investment using those inherited wealth. So in that sense, the economic equality of opportunity that Paul Romer uses of the effort versus circumstances, how much one can say, inequality, is allowed, is based on one's effort, one's circumstances. In India's context, I think it's very blurring, the distinction is blurring. Equally, outcome too matters. And how do we think of it? That's open to the debate, but definitely the distinction is very important to rethink about this distinction, because since just simply subsidies or the food bills and other things may not solve this problem. Perhaps in that sense, I think the intervention require both what I would call ex ante and ex post, and both sides level of intervention is required. So in that case, we know right from the Piketty's and others work, it's clearly in any society degree of inequality is political choice. And just society requires creating a level playing field, altering this enduring legacy of inherited wealth that block opportunities and life choices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalai. Is Vikash speaking or?
Yeah, I guess he'll take a question and okay. That's how we planned. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
You've made excellent time. So we have more time for Q&A at the moment. And thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Now I'll open the floor to Q&A, both to online audience and in person. And those online attendees, can you use the raise hand function to pose your questions or paste your question into the chat box, stating your name and affiliation where possible. We will start with the in-room, in-person questions first. Yes, Mike.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. And we do a lot of work in the III on wealth inequality, mostly in developed rich countries. And so really interesting to get this comparison. I was interested in what you're making about the importance of inheritance, which I completely can understand, and that's very convincing. One of the issues that poses is that the situation of people from wealthy families who may not inherit until their 50s or 60s, when their parents die. And there's lots of discussion in the UK about the situation of people who have not yet inherited. And I wonder if that's an issue in India and how the intergenerational conflicts or tensions may be linked to that. And linked to that point too is about significance of dowries and how marriage dynamics are linked into wealth, and if it's becoming an increasingly important factor in marriage, the organization of marriage structures.
Yeah.
Okay, you could. Do you hear Mike's question? Kalai?
Yes, I could. So want to collect a few questions, then address one by one?
No, you could go for it now.
Yeah, I can go. Yeah. So yeah, thank you. I couldn't get the name fully. Yeah, because I couldn't see. Yeah, thank you for this wonderful question. Definitely very important, because that's in fact our the title itself, inheritance. So one difference that we see, the inheritance, the way it works in advanced countries and the legal regime under which that inheritance works in advanced countries, it looks like different than the way it works in India. The inheritance, particularly with respect to the law, is the Hindu undivided family. That's one mechanism of how the wealth is distributed. For example, family leaving the wealth to their heirs. And I think there's a very defined laws, and I think it controls in many ways. Unlike in the other part where the will is required, I think here there is a certain level of pre-given situation, and also the exclusion of women and the long battle around that. So that way, actually, it's much more pre-given in that sense in India of this, particularly the land and the family asset that actually continues over a time, moving from one family to the other family, instead of as a gift, which is the case from the other part of the world, if I understand that question well. I think that here is much more pre-given, and also that also used in a way of protecting oneself from the taxation, particularly of the if it comes in the capital side. So that way, there's one level of ownership, another level of the taxation. In both ways, actually, this the institution, the family institution in India, particularly the Hindu undivided family. Of course, there's also similar regime available for other religion too, personal laws, and there are certain things works with which actually protects this, ensuring it necessarily goes to the its own generation in that sense. I think that's continued to be the case. I think unlike the advanced countries where you have different forms of the gift been as in the form of gift, again you can say the port of the gift is going to the one generation to the other generation. I think is a problem. If I can
there is one thing I would like to add, Kalai. Yeah, thanks, Mike, please, for the question. We do not have a panel data to track. We do not have a panel data to track, the whole dowry thing. We are hoping to have one additional set of empirical analysis to take care of the lands owned by the females in the households. We are hoping to do it. I am not very sure to what extent women have answered in the surveys, but yeah, we are actually keeping our fingers crossed. Thank you.
Thanks, Vikash. We have one question from online, and then we'll come back to the question. Eleanor?
Yeah, hi, Kalai. Nice to see you. I had, the overall argument that you're making is, very clear and very convincing. At the start, you were really drawing a distinction between urban and rural spaces, and then it looked like you were in the correlation matrix that you presented. However, when you were talking about the associations between land and education, for example, there didn't seem to be any differentiation into urban and rural spaces. And I wonder whether or not you might have something of a sort of a Simpsons paradox going on there, where you could have very different associations between land and education in urban and rural spaces. So if urban living people are going to be more educated and have more land, you might end up sort of disguising a very different pattern if you were to disaggregate and look at urban versus rural. And so then I wonder more generally if there are just very different historical trends that you might expect to see about the role of land in urban versus rural spaces. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. It's definitely very important. Definitely, there is a difference. Even we saw even the size of the coefficient also varies from urban and rural, and even for both correlation, also in the regression thing, we should have shown here. I mean, there's definitely a connection, but not sure. Definitely, there's a difference between the way in which education and the land or education and the building interacts in the urban, the way in which it interacts in the rural. Definitely, there is a connection in the urban. But the larger point that we want to make is in India's case, looks like this what you call the three dominant propertier thing seems to be continuing the leakage. That's what we wanted to say through this exercise, partly of say how the landed elite has continued to have some history, and the capital who has a family business, which you call as a property, another trend. Then you have a historically professional and or the educated caste. You can also see the caste also equally, what you call isomorphic in a way of certain communities get to have a more landed connection. Certain communities will tend to have a capital connection. Certain communities would tend to have a education connection. Then the majority are excluded from all three as a laboring and artisan. That mechanism I think still hold, but we are not sure. We are not making that argument stronger because we are not even ourselves sure how much this connection that we see the tenuous connection is applicable. Maybe we'll look at carefully much more, adding more variables and controlling more variable and see how this distinction urban and rural. But given this exercise, this is what we tend to make a tentative, tend to think and make a tentative conclusion out inference from this exercise. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Kalai, for that, Professor.
It's a very interesting talk. Compared to the United States, my impression is that in India, the land may benefit, not just a nuclear family, but a more extended set of relatives. So even though the land is held by one person, other people may benefit by not having to pay rent, for example. But also, if you could talk about the role of the courts, I understand that the legal structure is quite moribund and rigid and slow in India, and if that has played a role in this continuity over time.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Professor. It's wonderful. Yeah, very important question. Yeah, definitely. This is again analysis by a political scientist called Rob Junkin. Actually, he mapped the legislation related to the land acquisition and see the the messy way in which the land acquisition or the land market works, and which is partly connected to the historical legacy of this joint family or one part, and the political economy of the landed elite. And the state also wants to continue or maintain this. It is not really land is, again, it's not any other commodity in that sense. It's, of course, is a very culturally rooted, and that culture also partly responsible for this inequality in this sense, particularly for the gender and also for the different caste groups. So it weigh both of the one level of the legal regimes of its history and the cultural aspect of it, and the modern political economy of the needs of the industry, the change, all actually interacts in producing the kind of inequality that we see, particularly with the land. So it is definitely that part is the cultural part of the joint family, and that again, gender and caste connection one track. Then the legal regime, the way in which the land is part of became the state center, and the legislation around that, and the requirement of the modern political economy in terms of the industrialization, urban turn, all that. So all three actually some way interacts in the kind of outcome that we see now. I think that also messy and varies across the regions in India too, because again, the land part of it large part actually fall under the state the state list in the constitutional schemes. There's a center, state, and the union list, and there's also the divide between the state versus center, and which also partly plays a role in changing the most of the land value, range of ways that it actually affects the state intervention. So this is a messy way, and all three actors play in this outcome. So I think needs to be seen case by case, and perhaps that requires the case study actually of the specific regions, the specific city, how this works. I know that's many some works are already available, but the particular one I can think of is the Sai Balakrishna's work in Pune and another part of city in Maharashtra. 3 cities is covered on this question. Yeah.
Thanks, Kalai. Being the chair's prerogative, I have 2 questions. The one is about declining significance of land in India, especially with the growth of service sector or the desire to be part of the service sector.
Yeah.
And secondly, there is also a lot of movement towards urban areas and leaving behind the significance of agriculture itself is reducing. And therefore, do you think that's going to have an impact on wealth?
Yeah.
That's one question.
Yeah.
And the second question is in relation to caste and wealth.
Okay.
Because if you look at, is there any specific caste that by being that caste have a kind of a cultural significance for accumulating wealth, or some kind of a essence has come into being a specific caste? Like I have in mind to look at the 10, the biggest billionaire, the richest 10 families in India. You find most of them, 7 or 8 of them, actually belong to one particular caste called Baniya. Baniya is a business community, business class, like Adanis, Ambanis, Birlas, Mittal. All these are belonging to a specific caste.
Yeah.
So how does being a member of a specific caste adds to some kind of a cultural essence that makes them to earn more money?
Yeah.
And they are not landowning communities, basically. These are all into business.
Yeah. So clearly, I'll start with the last question. As I mentioned, this exercise partly underestimates the capital aspect of wealth, particularly the financial aspect of wealth. And I must say here, thanks actually raising this question. It also allows me to open up the debate a little wider way, say by bringing in I would like to use this, say Rudolph and Rudolph scheme. Those who are not familiar with the scheme, she has this, as I rightly mentioned, caste and occupational or caste and economic status, how they historically evolved. Where exactly she says, as you mentioned, the certain communities tend to have a capital connection historically, traders as a as an occupation as a traders, and later mopped out as an industrialist from the colonial time to post-colonial time, and they continued to thrive even the post-90s of the economic reform. There is you can find a remarkable continuity of that certain communities. And of course, there are some people who have added to it, which I would call from the professional class to entering into the domain of capital. That again, well documented region by region. So definitely there is a connection between the economic status and the caste position, which is with respect to business, also respect to professionals who could become a successful professionals as a advocates, lawyers, doctors. There is a connection again. People have different regions. People have estimated based on the field work, and one can make a connection based on those studies. And the thing is similarly laboring, artisan, again land, who is the cultivator, again there is a connection. It's not that all cultivator would fall under one caste or one caste member all become a cultivator. There'll be a more or less higher level of correlation, one can say. It's not that one community all become a cultivator in one community. Of course there could be diversification, but disproportionately you will find a connection between, but it's also breaking in the post-90s. But you're right, there is certainly the connection. And I can say this is not in this work, I have shown in the other work of if you use this something called economic census in India, which provides you caste and capital connection, in the sense entrepreneurship. Clearly there is a marker, as you mentioned rightly now, that marker you clearly find of the caste and entrepreneurship connection. That's very, very well documented, and it is there, and we should take into account. But that wealth, I doubt that is actually fully accounted in this wealth calculation, because a lot of them would be the financial wealth. I think that this survey underestimates this. That's as I mentioned earlier. Definitely, I think if we bring that, I think it's tough, it's difficult actually to get those valuation of asset and incorporate it. We need to use certain assumptions. That's what the World Inequality Report team, I think they are doing that. Using certain estimates, certain assumption to bring this capital into the wealth story. Definitely in this survey, I think the capital is underestimated. Definitely land is overestimated. So with respect to the decline of agriculture in GDP, agriculture as a sector in the modern economy, and the land connection, you are very much true. As I think I've written also, this also I've worked with and one of my with the political scientist called Christophe Deferlet, worked with him on the mapping, say, charts and Patels and some of this community, which are agrarian communities, because of the decline of the land, particularly decline of the agriculture, agrarian weight actually came down in the post-90s. In fact, moved into asking this status of affirmative action question. In the sense, they seems to have lost in this. Definitely, they're not able to compete fully with the in service sector. Partly also they lost their, perhaps are not fully lost, or losing the status in the rural area of their control. It is not of the deprivation, perhaps the losing control. So, which is definitely direct outcome of what you are seeing of the decline of agriculture. But I must say, back to caveat, again, this is from our own data, also from the field work. Land value, actually, those agrarian communities which are connected with the land did gain from the post-reform, even in the rise of the service economy, even in the context of the decline of agriculture. So the wealth generation via real estate and the construction needs to be, our service sector needs to be differentiated participation in the sectoral economy. Sectoral economy, definitely agriculture has declined. But whether they were able to participate fully in they means here is the cultivators or the peasants who actually connected to the agriculture, whether they were able to participate in the modern economy is the question. That is actually is a larger, what economists call as a structural transformation question in India. How the economy transformed from agriculture to industry, whether the industry service growth that we have is able, or will it be able to absorb all the people who are cultivators who are associated with agriculture into the modern economy is the question. Again, even what terms they will shift. I think that is the outcome. Perhaps I would read the farm protest that took place in Delhi for a year. Is partly, I would not think of that question is simply of those 3 bills of those who are familiar with those 3 bills of say contract farming or the MSP, all that. I think that the protest was largely of the anxiety whether they will be able to participate or get the status they enjoy in the rural, in the urban economy. It is in fact of that anxiety, which actually of the anxiety of losing agriculture or ability or inability to participate in the modern economy. I think that transition anxiety, given the uncertainty in the modern sector, given the service-led growth, is a source of that anxiety. I think that anxiety worked across the agrarian communities in India, but more or less different. Of course, there are different ways. It worked in the south, it worked in the north, it worked in the west. So the urban movement also is connected again. Is a question, definitely the urban movement, whether, again, question is whether they were being able to participate in the urban economy is the question, again, is the open question, whether in a dignified way, but did gain in the particularly of the urban, what you call urban rural gradation. Those who are familiar with called Rurban, there's an urban literature called Rurban area. In those domain, obviously, many of these communities were tied with agriculture through the land valuation, got gained. I think that's only the one which gets reflected in the data that we see the wealth inequality here through the land.
If I may, I just need to show one table. Kalai, could you show the table of land and caste?
Yeah, I'll come. This? Yeah.
Yes. So if we just see the number, just see the third column, share of land in average household wealth. In fact, we were amazed to see the numbers to be consistent, roughly around 60% for across all the 4 caste groups that we have. ST is 61%, SC 57%, OBC 61%, UCs, that is unreserved classes, 60%. So irrespective of different categories of caste groups, land is a very important asset, one thing. But there are some castes which generally falls in UCs and OBCs. They are mostly known for the unlanded. We have been unable to capture it through this data. We hope to do it using the state level analysis. So once we interact state level and caste groups, we should have a more clearer picture, because we were very surprised to see this third column. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalai. And now we have come to the end of this seminar today. It's been a pleasure for me to chair today's event. Thank you very much, Kalai and Vikash, for presenting this seminar. And thank you everyone in the audience who joined us. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, George. Thank you, team, for
having us. The brilliant work as usual.
Thank you all for having us.
The entire team for yeah. Thank you. Yeah.